If you ever needed proof that any piece of literature can be discussed ad nauseum and debated endlessly for years and years, then you need to get on the normal people train, if that's the kind of fun you like to have. It's been about 2 years since Normal People came out, and in that time, the TV show has appeared. So I wanted to reread Normal People with a fresh eye before watching the show. I have now reread it, and I haven't finished the show. The show, from what I've seen, is really, really good, and it's faithful, and I'm pretty sure that Sally Rooney was a consultant slash screenwriter for the show as well, and that's really great. The show isn't what I want to talk about, though. I want to talk about the conversation that is surrounding Normal People again, and how it's kind of deepened in the last 2 years since we all first read it. Christmas 2018. I fly home from Tokyo to spend Christmas with my people from family. Well, I find that so hard to say. My partner, Jess, bought me a copy of Normal People, not this one. And I bought into the hype completely. I was really, really excited to read the book, and it turned out to be a fantastic read. There was so much about the book that I really, really adored. Then the criticism starts coming in, and all these lovely hot takes. And a lot of the hot takes surrounded things like the fact that it was overly simplistic. This was an ongoing argument that it was about teenagers, and the politics wasn't as deep and thought-provoking as it should have been, and these people were making terrible mistakes with their lives, and it was a repetitive will they won't they on and off relationship, and the class struggle between them isn't as well thought out as it could be. And I argue that all of that is wrong because of the context. Sally Rooney is a woman in her late 20s who is able so perfectly to create and write and breathe life into two idiot children. These are people in their late teens. Do you remember being in your late teens where you were not half as smart as you wanted to be, not half as smart as you thought you were, and certainly not half as smart as most of the people around you? And these are two people who are trying to find themselves, figure out who they are and the way that they're behaving. So much of what people didn't like about these characters was written on the walls within the book. They are faulted characters. They are broken. They are in a transitional period in their lives, and Sally Rooney so perfectly manages to represent that. Now, in the 2 years since the book was written and released, there have been some really interesting articles that have broken down the book and the context around it, the socio-economic, political landscape surrounding the book, in such intensely fascinating ways that I really wanted to discuss them here. In September 2019, Finn McRedmond wrote a piece for the Irish Times that was titled, and I don't know if he wrote the headline, "Are Sally Rooney's Heroines Too Skinny?" And you're going to walk into an article like that with a lot of prejudged cynicism. But the article turned out to be actually kind of compelling and thought-provoking. In the piece, McRedmond asked the question, is it a problem that these wildly popular and accessible novels seem to glorify unhealthy eating habits and link desirability or beauty with the characters' tiny frames? It certainly wouldn't be a first for novels about young women. Rooney seems to go further than most, with her character's thinness made more conspicuous by its absence in other characters. Some way through Normal People, the other protagonist, Connell, finds himself with a new girlfriend. Helen is nice and uncomplicated. Her weight isn't commented on. In conversations with friends, the protagonist, Frances, is similar to Marianne. Both are waif-like and bony. We rarely see either of them eat, and both are smart too. Frances is a talented poet, who one day struggles to produce any poetry of worth after eating some toast. A few pages later, she writes some of her best work. Rooney also notes that Frances hadn't eaten properly in days. There is undeniably, there has been for decades, generations, a romanticism wrapped around the concept and the image of the starving or struggling artist. People romanticize depression and anxiety. We romanticize anorexia and other eating disorders, mental health disorders. We romanticize drug addiction and the way that it makes people look, feel, behave. And when it kills them, we martyr them. I never, for a moment when reading Normal People, considered that perhaps her characters could be framed in that same light. Probably because I was brought in by that same romanticism, I just didn't see it, and I didn't consider it. I didn't deconstruct it enough at the time. Do I think that this is a failing of the novel? I don't know. I haven't sat with it long enough, even though I've just reread it. I don't know. I definitely think it's an issue, and I definitely think it's a criticism worth making and something that we should be discussing. Yeah. It's interesting. And what I'm doing here is kind of fighting against these criticisms, arguing that it's still a worthwhile book to enjoy, and also asking the bigger question, what does it mean to enjoy something when there are criticisms to be made? And how far do we have to go to defend the things that we love? I think often it comes down to how much of a problem the problem is. That's a biggie. There's also author's intent. Did Sally Rooney know what she was doing? If she did, why? It's a big topic. I think it's a really interesting one. And not for a moment am I willing to dislike the book or stop enjoying it or any of Rooney's art, but I definitely am glad that it was brought up. Just a few months ago, I watched and have since rewatched Fleabag, which was a show written and created by and starring Phoebe Waller-Bridge. I thought Fleabag was incredible. I didn't really see any downsides to it. And then I stumbled across an article which talks about Fleabag and the writings of Sally Rooney. Really interesting stuff. This article was written by Rebecca Liu for Another Gaze back in June 2019. In the article, Rebecca Liu talks about how Sally Rooney is a millennial writer of the Snapchat generation, whose Marxist commitments hang awkwardly and slip away in the far easier branding of her a promising young woman ready to be taken up by the glossy, politically toothless world of high literary society. Now, this entire article is worth reading. It talks about things that you may not have seen or read, but it makes an enormous... It's a wonderful character study, not just in the characters within the fiction that it examines, but also the writers who are creating it and the society who creates them. Fascinating stuff. I don't really have a grander point to make about this particular article, but it has gotten me thinking about how we need to examine things that even may seem positive or new, and what that newness exactly says about us as a generation, us as a society, and us in this particular zeitgeist that we find ourselves in. I definitely didn't think when I read Normal People that something like this would occur, where there would be endless discussions to be had about how the book portrays a generation, a gender, a sex, a group of people in any sense. What I mostly took away from Normal People when I read it was that it felt like a Jane Austen novel for our generation. And I've heard other people say similar things, and what I mean by this is that Jane Austen famously tore apart the class politics of her period. And Sally Rooney here does exactly the same thing. Normal People is a fairly simplistic story, and it's intended to be such. It is simplistic in its very visual appearance. The stripped bare cover art of the UK edition is absolutely beautiful. And within the text itself, when you just flick through it, what you can see are block paragraphs with very little punctuation. Just from a glance, you can see that there is a kind of minimalism and simplicity to it. And that's made clear in the text as well. These are fairly simple, normal people. And what I'm doing here isn't some grand literary study at all, but I'm pointing out the fact that by making these people very relatable and by making this very approachable fiction, what she's allowing us to do is easy consideration of ourselves, how we were when we were younger, our political standing, our political opinions, our attitude towards each other, mostly in consideration of sex and gender. So, Normal People is a good book, but Every criticism that I've seen about it recently has been absolutely fascinating, and I'm really glad that it exists. So I describe the book as Austen-like, a book that deals in class politics. You've got Marianne and Connell. They're from two different parts of town. They are from two different classes in early 21st century Ireland. She is from a rich family, even though they're not the kindest people. He is from a working class family of far kinder people. His mum works as a cleaner for her mum, and that's how they know each other, as well as the fact that they go to school together. But they're from different sides of the tracks, right? Now, this isn't necessarily that tangential, is that the right word? Fuck it. With Austen, but it also kind of is, because you've got this romantic setup of two different people who are similar enough and yet different enough to create a relatively encouraging and a story with enough inertia that it keeps you invested. I feel like I'm rambling now. Normal People, when I read it, never seemed like something that I would still be thinking and talking about 2 years later. But I'm really, really glad that we are. What I'm sad about is that fan bases around the world and through various different forms of media are very, very much shouting match these days. If you look at the video games industry, if you look at Star Wars, if you look at anything really where passions are high, people love to shout and scream. And when you shout and scream, you create two separate echo chambers that people sit in and don't listen to each other. We know this. I just didn't think it would happen with Normal People, and I can't lie, it's kind of exciting, and I'm sure that Sally Rooney is thrilled that her book is still being talked about so vehemently. It's got to be a wonderful feeling, if a little heartrending, for a writer who's so young and also so talented. It's really exciting. So the conversation surrounding Normal People is ongoing, especially considering that the show is coming out and people are watching it. I'm excited about that. And I'm really, really glad that there is so much to unpack when I thought all was pretty much said and done. I even when I reread the book, I still didn't analyze it the way that other people have. What I did was listen to flippant comments, dismissive critiques of it, saying, will they, won't they, it's too repetitive. I don't care enough about these characters, they seem wooden, etc., etc. And I often just defended it by pointing out the fact that these are teenagers in a transition period in their lives. When I was their age, I was this mushy idiot. I was an angry atheist who thought that the worst thing in the world was organized religion. We were all very naive at that age, and if we weren't, well, that's because we were Mary Shelley type geniuses. Most of us were like Connell. I was Connell, but dumber. And I think to write a character like Connell shows a greater understanding of that particular period in our lives, the college-university period. So that's my defense against flippant comments. I don't really have a defense against these exploratory articles, these investigations into the psyches of these characters, but I am absolutely thrilled because I knew at least when Normal People came out that it was a book about the world around us now, our zeitgeist, our people. It's a millennial book. It absolutely is. Sally Rooney is a millennial writer speaking to a millennial crowd. I still love Normal People. I really do. I love this book. I turn to it for comfort. I turn to it for entertainment. I turn to it for a little bit of relatability. And some of these articles have pointed out that these characters aren't actually as relatable as you think they are. And that's challenging for me, and I want to be challenged. But I still do turn to it for that. I think all of us enjoy characters that we can relate to in some form or another, and I can definitely relate to Connell while also feeling jealous that I wasn't actually as smart as him when I was younger. And the fact that Connell isn't all that likable as a character makes me think, Jesus Christ, what was I like? And from that perspective, I love Normal People.